Would you willingly wear clothing if you knew it belonged to Amrosi or Myra Hindley or Charles Manson? Are you, in other words, superstitious? As if the clothing were tainted with evil. Or wouldn't you mind? Bruce Hood has done that sort of experiment, and he's also worked out that superstition is sort of wired in when we're young as a kind of extra. We believe in the supernatural because we're trying to make sense of the normal world.
The idea is simply that we're born with brains which have evolved to make sense of a complex world by seeking patterns and trying to understand the mechanisms responsible for those patterns. And in doing so, and this operates early, it's an intuitive, it's an untutored process. In doing so, children sometimes come up with misconceptions or assumptions which can be seen to be the basis of later adult supernatural beliefs. So the idea is that one source of beliefs is from within the child, not necessarily through storytelling or indoctrination. Now, whether education can eradicate these ideas is another issue, because I think that these, because they're intuitive and early emerging, may actually be dormant in the adult and emerge at times of stress and uncertainty. So you're almost having to fight against some of these intuitions, I think, as an adult. And there is evidence from other laboratories showing that when adults are put under stressful situations, or they have to respond quickly, or indeed if they have a degree of compromised mental function through brain disease, they revert back to these superstitious ways of thinking. So I think that's something that's with us, it's part of the human condition, it's almost a byproduct of the way that our brains have evolved.
So you're suggesting it's almost built in, and what is it for?
Well, because it's a byproduct, it means that the other mechanisms which generate their true causal understanding of the world will occasionally turn out these spurious assumptions. So it's not for anything in particular, it's just a byproduct of a system which is designed to interpret the world.
And so it's quite separate from something like a religious belief, a religious tendency?
Absolutely. I think religions have successfully capitalized upon superstitious beliefs because they need something that goes over and beyond the verifiable evidence. They need things to be taken on trust. They need things which have to be understood at some, or accepted at some profound and not mundane level. And that's why they work so well. But ultimately, religions are culturally constructed and transmit through storytelling and indoctrination in that sense.
So did you do a survey of secular beliefs? In other words, separating out the non-religious part population from the religious part?
More so, actually. We've done empirical surveys. We've actually looked at beliefs about moral contamination, for example. This was an idea I talked about 3 years ago to you, the idea of the killer's cardigan. I think a similar mechanism is operating in the way that we don't want to touch objects which we think are contaminated. And we just had a study accepted on our attitudes towards organ transplantations from donors who we learn or discover to be morally corrupt. And not surprising, people are very reluctant at the prospect of having a heart or a liver transplant from someone they discover has been an evil murderer. Now, there's a number of reasons why you might think that, but one of the reasons I think is because it triggers this psychological essentialism. And this is an idea that we naturally think that there's an inner property to the material or living world that is responsible for the identity or makes something unique. And so, for example, when we say somebody is evil to the core, we're treating evil as if it's almost physically manifest, and it could contaminate the physical organ, and that's something that could be then transmitted into transplant patients. Just
to remind, 3 years ago we talked about whether you would actually have a cardigan from a murderer if you were given it free, you know, absolutely wonderful cardigan and every reason to take it, but because it had this terrible provenance, you'd turn it down. But when you mention the organs being transplanted, I remember a documentary that actually said that some heart recipients developed the characteristic of the donors. They suddenly started to write poetry or something extraordinary. There's no evidence for that whatever, is there?
There's a lot of anecdotal evidence for that. And I would hasten to add that, in fact, transplant patients do experience profound changes in their personality. Now, there's very good physiological reasons for that. If you consider that these people have been near to the point of death and they've had to take medication and then they're given a new lease of life, it's not surprising that they feel different and think differently about life afterwards. But then to attribute that to somehow incorporating the personality of the donor, there's no scientific model that I'm aware of that could explain that. I am familiar with the documentary we're talking about. There was a pseudoscience theory about what was called cellular memory. And indeed there were some studies which claimed that animals who were trained to run mazes, if you grind them up and feed them to other animals, they can then learn the maze much quicker. But these have generally been dismissed as poor studies. So there isn't any scientific explanation for what is a common assumption. About 1 in 3 transplant patients feel that they've taken on some aspect of the donor.
Let me give you a complicated answer maybe that was published recently about storytelling, and that is that we really need, in a cultural sense, stories really to form cultures, to tell histories. If you go back to Aboriginal history, you know, there are storylines that go back thousands of years and they're combined with songs and whatever that tell you something about where you belong and reinforce that feeling of belonging. Now, it's not surprising that if you're being imaginative like that, that you'd have a few kind of add-ons, as you said in the beginning, a few mysterious, almost magical things. Could it be perhaps the story's the thing rather than the supernatural part?
I think it's probably likely to be a combination. Now, Pascal Boyer and Scott Atrin are anthropologists who've been analysing the nature of stories and religious concepts and myths and how they transmit. And what it turns out from their studies is that there are universals of certain stories, and they have to have a degree of supernatural component to them. And these stories which have this degree of the mystical, the fantastical, they transmit that much better because they trigger within us this sense of the profound rather than this just being another kind of boring story. So yes, you're right. The narrative is important for making sense and giving you a sense of cohesion and connection. But this supernatural component these stories contain, usually something about a spirit or something like that, makes them that much more pertinent. And that's why they do so well and transmit down through the generations.
There are stories, however, there's evidence of people having perceptions. I've had them myself, where you think you're seeing something. You know, like the explanations for near-death experience, where a whole number of people, not least in Harvard, they've done experiments to show that it might have been the effect on the brain of depleted oxygen or whatever, that you get different sorts of feelings. The ergotism of the ancients, well, the Middle Ages, where you were infected by a fungus. I mean, all sorts of ways that you can get these sorts of things. Could there not be physiological explanations that supersede those?
Well, I think what you've pointed to is the common fact that, look, our lives are punctuated by strange things all the time. There are coincidences which just seem so bizarre, and it's what we make sense of them and how we interpret them which defines whether we're a believer or a non-believer. Yes, I do not believe in a spiritual world, and I think that for every phenomenon there must be some natural explanation to it. It's how we interpret these phenomena which define whether we're believers or not. And it's partly, as I've said, this inclination to make the assumption of causal mechanisms where there may be none in fact operating. And that's what is the basis for the supernatural belief.
And of course some people have suggested that if there's a genetic basis, you know, lots of kids have propensity, there must be genes for it. And what about the God gene? You've dismissed that.
Well, I've dismissed it in the same way as I dismissed that there was a gene for Shakespeare. I mean, no one would contest the issue that there are genes for language, because every child learns a language. But the language you acquire depends on the environment in which you're raised. In the same way, the religion that you acquire depends on the environment in which you're raised as well. So religions are complex, cultural, constructed accounts of where we've come from, how we should lead our lives, and where we're going. All religions have components, universal components, for example, the notion of the afterlife, or that the soul is somehow different to the body. But these components, I would contest, are probably the result of the byproducts I've said that we're born with. But that doesn't mean that a belief in religion or God is the inevitable consequence. So, yes, the components of religion have aspects which probably do have a biological basis, but the full gamut of religion and the way it's expressed and so forth clearly is a cultural phenomenon.
His book is called Supersense, From Superstition to Religion, The Brain Science of Belief, and Bruce Hood is Professor of Developmental Psychology at the University of Bristol.